And for our presentation tonight, I've been looking forward to this for many weeks now. Ryan reached out to Ethan and me a couple of months ago about MRBO's King Rail data. King Rail and many other marsh bird species are of high conservation concern here in Missouri. They're pretty difficult to study, and relatively little is known about their status and distribution, both in Missouri and really across the country. So we were super excited when Ryan then agreed to present this webinar on his own research investigating exactly those things: status, distribution, potential conservation implications, and how to study king rail and other secretive marsh birds. So Ryan McGinty recently signed on as the Wetland Community Ecologist with the Missouri Department of Conservation. In January 2025, he completed his MS degree at SUNY Brockport, studying management associations of breeding secretive marsh birds in Missouri. Prior to this, he completed a bachelor's degree in wildlife ecology at Pittsburg State University. So Ryan, please take it away. The floor is yours.
That's good.
Okay.
Yep, perfect. All right.
So, yeah, I'm Ryan McGinty. I'm right now the Wetland Community Ecologist of the Missouri Department of Conservation. Started about 4 months ago, but prior to this, as Dana said, I was working on my master's studying king rail and other secretive marsh birds in Missouri. So, first, talk a little bit about king rail and what they are. So king rail are a species of secretive marsh bird. Secretive marsh birds are these cryptic water birds that occupy tall, emergent, persistent vegetation within marsh communities. They vocalize relatively infrequently, and they are very difficult to detect visually just because of the habitat they're in, right? So they're in the kind of cattails, bulrush, and they can be pretty hard to detect. Because of this, long-term modern efforts such as the Breeding Bird Survey have really undersampled these species, in part because wetlands in general are undersampled, but also just because they are very hard to detect without somewhat specialized detection methods. So that said, king rail are residents of much of the East Coast around the Gulf of Mexico and up along that Atlantic Ocean. They stay there year-round. However, there are certain populations of king rail that are going to migrate inland to breed during the spring and summer. So you can see along the Mississippi up into Missouri, that's a pretty big hotspot, and then scattered throughout the rest of the state. So Wisconsin's another big one, but really scattered distributions and really not good information on any kind of like accurate distributions, abundance, and other metrics of that nature. Not able. There we go. All right. So if we want to kind of get an idea of the current distribution of king rail in Missouri, it's sometimes helpful to kind of take a step back and look at the past distribution. So as I said before, there's no great examples of a long-term monitoring of these species. However, there is a fair amount of anecdotal records of king rail being far more abundant throughout the state and really throughout the entire Midwest, this migratory breeding range, than they are right now. And again, there's no quantitative metrics really put to that, but just observationally, people have noticed a decline in this species really since people have been here. There has been one study that I found in the 80s that I think is a pretty interesting study to look at. So at Ted Shanks Conservation Area, which is one of the Missouri Department of Conservation's intensively managed wetlands. When this dissertation was done in the 80s, they found, I think, around 60 king rail nests at this one property within I want to say 5-year period. And as you'll find out pretty shortly, that's quite a lot of nests for at least current distributions. So even since the 80s, we've seen a pretty stark decline in this species. There have been other studies in recent times, somewhat recent times. So in 2006 and 2007, there was a Darn and Crimmins paper that looked at publicly managed wetlands above the St. Louis area, and they were able to detect king rail at Clarence Canyon National Wildlife Refuge, Ted Shanks Conservation Area, and B.K. Leach Conservation Area. And then in 2013 and 2014, there was another effort by a guy named Evan Hill, and he surveyed really throughout the entire state of Missouri, looking for these species, and he was able to detect them at several sites. There we go. Swan Lake National Wildlife Refuge, Fountain Grove, Los Bluffs, and Nodaway Valley. As well as BK Leach Conservation Area. So again, we don't have a great idea of the current distribution, but anecdotally, really before the study I'm about to present, it was kind of thought that even since these studies took place, so 2000s, 2010s, we've even seen more decline in this species. So what are some potential explanations for this decline? The most obvious one is the drastic wetland loss we've seen in the entire country. But as you can see on this graph here, especially in the Midwest, we've just seen tons of wetland loss due to conversion to agriculture and urban development. Because of this, a lot of the wetland habitat that remains in Missouri is going to be on publicly managed wetlands. They just make up a greater proportion of that total wetland habitat because of this historic loss. But that said, one of the more famous studies looking at wetland loss, this Dahl 1990 paper, really spanned from when we first came over and settled this land to about the 80s, and we lost about 87% of the total wetlands in the United States, or in Missouri, and then around 50% in the United States. And that said, we still see this drastic decline of king rail even since the 80s. And there could be, this could be a lag effect. So we lost those wetland habitat, and then it took the king rail a little bit to really decline. But in this study, we had to look at potential other explanations to the decline of king rail during this time, and particularly how we manage our public wetlands. So public wetlands, we're going to define those as wetlands that use water control structures such as levees and pumps to control when water is pumped into and drained out of wetlands. Typically in these intensively managed wetlands, they promote early successional plant communities. So these are plant communities that come up quickly, usually annual plants, and they produce a high amount of seed. That seed is available for the forage of waterfowl. We tend to try to get rid of as much woody vegetation as possible, and then time the flooding of these impoundments with waterfowl migrations and hunting seasons. A term you'll hear a lot is moist soil management, and that's really referring to those moist soil plants that are going to be coming up. And really what we're managing for is a food source for waterfowl. So this kind of looks like you'll have a wetland in the spring, and that'll be totally inundated with water, some vegetation there as well. You'll drain that down, trying to mimic some hydrology that might not exist in the landscape anymore. And then you're going to come in there with some artificial disturbances, such as disking or mowing, to disrupt some of that vegetation, setback succession, and allow these annuals to come back in. And then in the fall, you can flood those pools back up in time for the waterfowl to come and provide good hunting opportunities and waterfowl habitat. We can look at the frequencies of these disturbances. So typically when we talk about moist soil management, we're really talking about annual disturbances where you're drawing down the pool, doing some kind of disturbance, and then flooding it back up. And that's going to result in those, like I said, annual vegetation, interspersion of mud flats. But some pools will also be managed with less frequent disturbances, and that can result in more robust perennial vegetation that may provide less seed for waterfowl, but can provide good habitat for invertebrates and will still produce some seeds. But it'll also provide more cover in the terms of robust perennial vegetation. Another important thing to think about when we're talking about drawdown is the timing of these drawdowns. So when I talk about timing, I'm really talking about the timing in the spring where the water is being drawn down from these areas. So managers will split these up into an early, mid-season, or late-season drawdown. And depending on when these are being drawn down, they have a pretty drastic impact on the vegetative community. So earlier season drawdowns, again, are going to result in more of those mud flats interspersed with water, less vegetative cover, while later season drawdowns are usually timed with the start of new vegetative growth and have more vegetative cover, potential habitat for secretive marsh birds. So this Malone et al. 2023 paper was looking at wetland management in the Midwest. And they found that the majority of wetlands in this region are being done around April and May, which would generally be considered early or mid-season drawdown. So to kind of bring this all together, we've got waterfowl management. We also have secretive marsh bird habitat requirements, and we're trying to really see how the current management practices being conducted at our publicly managed wetlands and the needs of waterfowl and secretive marsh birds overlap, and really try to identify if there's a sweet spot in there somewhere where we can kind of meet the needs of multiple objectives. So that said, as I said before, the status and distribution of king rail and other secretive marsh birds is not well known. The Missouri Department of Conservation wanted to fund this project to get a better understanding of that current population, but we didn't really want to stop there. We also wanted to look at some potential causes of this decline. So because of that, we also wanted to look at habitat and how the different habitat characteristics at different wetlands might impact secretive marsh bird occupancy. And we also wanted to look at management, so determining the effects of the timing and frequency of wetland management actions on secretive marsh birds. So we had some hypotheses. So for habitat, there's been a fair amount of research for secretive marsh birds and their habitat requirements or preferences. So we predicted that the percent cover of tall emergent vegetation, water depth, and the degree of interspersion of water and vegetation would be positively associated with secretive marsh bird occupancy. And when I talk about interspersion, you could have 50% vegetation, you could have 50% water at two sites, and those could either be just separate masses of vegetation and water, or those could be kind of interspersed into a matrix. And we typically expect secretive marsh birds to prefer areas with a greater degree of interspersion of vegetation and water. There's been very few studies looking at management and the impacts of wetland management on secretive marsh birds, although there has been some evidence that intermediate levels of management could be positively associated with secretive marsh birds. That said, we predicted that late season drawdowns and less frequent disturbances, because they will promote more of that perennial emergent vegetation preferred by secretive marsh birds, would be positively associated with these species. So to test some of these hypotheses, we surveyed multiple wetlands throughout the state for two species in particular, so the king rail and the least bittern. We chose these species because they're the two species that regularly breed throughout the state. And then we use what's called the Standardized North American Marsh Bird Monitoring Protocol. This is a kind of formal way of surveying through secretive marsh birds using what we call call broadcast surveys. So call broadcast surveys are, we basically go out there with a speaker, we play different bird sounds and hope to elicit a response. And this can help when birds don't call very frequently, like secretive marsh birds. It gives you a better chance of detecting them. Additionally, wildlife species in general, and especially secretive marsh birds, are difficult to detect. And when we do an occupancy survey like this, we really want to try to account for that detection probability. So the probability that we're going to detect a species when it's present. So to do this, we can do multiple rounds of surveys at the same survey point. So in my case, we decided to go with 9 surveys to really increase the chances of detecting a species at one point. But then that'll also allow us to go back and calculate the probability we will detect a species when it's present and look at different variables that might influence that. So that could be the time of year you're surveying, the amount of background noise you're hearing, and other things that might affect your ability to detect a species when it's present. So the study was conducted in the state of Missouri, and we looked at past detections of king rail from eBird and the Missouri Heritage Database to inform our study. So we overlapped these points you see here with the different publicly managed wetlands. So we had 14 publicly managed wetlands in total, including national wildlife refuges managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service and conservation areas managed by the Missouri Department of Conservation. So in these 14 properties, we further delineated these into wetland pools. So think of a wetland pool as a place that's just completely surrounded by levees where you can really kind of control the hydrology. And then we further divided that into 84 survey points. So to decide where we're going to survey within these pools, we really wanted to survey areas with king rail habitat, right? So these wetlands aren't all going to be emergent marsh. Actually, a lot of them are not emergent marsh. So we could have areas of open water, just areas of bare ground, upland vegetation. So we talked with local wetland managers to identify pools that would have potential king rail habitat. So we defined king rail habitat as emergent vegetation interspersed with water with around less than 40% woody vegetation. And this just allows us to look for habitat characteristics associated with secretive marsh birds without, surveying areas where we already know they're not going to be, right? You wouldn't survey for whales in a prairie, right? So we wanted to survey for king rail in areas we think king rail could be, and then we can look at different habitat characteristics associated with emergent marsh. That said, we also put our survey points on roads and levees throughout these wetland pools. We decided to survey on roads and levees because these surveys have to be done in around 2 hours in the morning and evening. So we wanted to maximize the amount of survey points we could do. And this is when we were able to do that. Additionally, a lot of the emergent marsh vegetation in these pools is going to be kind of around these edges because of how these wetlands were originally made. They have some what are called burrow ditches where they kind of dug out soil to build up those levees. We then further ground truth all these points, again, to make sure they had emergent vegetation present. We only surveyed areas, again, with that interspersion of vegetation and water and less than 40% woody vegetation. So how these surveys work. So we show up at a site and there'll be a 5-minute passing period where we just stand there in the wetland and listen for any of our target species. So in our case, we really focused on king rail and least bittern. But after this 5-minute passing period, there was 30 seconds of bird calls, and we included 5 species. So least bittern, Sora, Virginia rail, king rail, and American bittern. Again, for this talk, we're really going to focus in on king rail and least bittern, although we did survey for these species as well. So we wanted to look at the different habitat characteristics. And to do this, we took water depth measurements at every survey point. We walked 25 meters in the wetland and then take a measurement 10 meters in every cardinal direction. We would also estimate a 50-meter radius half circle in front of every survey point. We got upland or whatever vegetation behind us, but we're trying to survey out into the wetland. And then we take measurements such as the percent cover of tall emergent vegetation, short emergent vegetation, percent cover of water. We'd estimate the interspersion of vegetation and water and the density of that tall emergent vegetation. We also wanted to get at these management practices and how those are affecting secretive marsh bird occupancy. As I said before, although there's been a decent amount of research looking at habitat characteristics, how management impacts these birds has largely been understudied. So we talked with local wetland managers, and they gave us information on the water level management and the management regimes. So the frequency of drawdowns and the timing of these drawdowns in the spring. They also gave us information on different artificial disturbances, such as prescribed burns, mowing, disking. And you can think of disking as just a tractor with these kind of discs that tilt the soil pretty shallowly behind that tractor. And it's just another way to set back succession. And then herbicide. So what do we find? We only detected in the spring of 2023 king rail at 3 properties. So Los Bluffs National Wildlife Refuge, Grand Pass, and BK Leach Conservation Area. Within these 3 properties, king rail were detected at 4 points, although at BK Leach, which had 2 points, those 2 points were in the same wetland pool. So very low detection rates for this species. Additionally, we detected least bittern at 5 properties. So Nodaway Valley, Los Bluffs, Grand Pass, BK Leach, and Ted Shanks. But we did have a lot more wetland pools in points. I think we had a total of 18 points with least bittern out of the 84. So we focused our further analysis on least bittern. We didn't have enough detections of king rail to do a robust statistical analysis. However, as I'll kind of talk more about later, least bittern may serve as useful surrogate species when trying to manage or make decisions regarding king rail conservation, although there's some caveats to that. So what do we find? We found that the percent cover of tall emergent vegetation was positively associated with leaf-bearing occupancy. So you can see it on this graph here. As the percent cover of tall emergent vegetation goes up, so does the occupancy probability of King Rail. You can see this kind of shaded area is going to be that confidence interval, and then that darker yellow line is going to be the mean. And we expect this relationship, right? King Rail, or leaf-bearing for this case, are going to use these dense stands of tall emergent vegetation. The more of that there is in the landscape, the more potential habitat. We also found that the percent cover of water, as that increases, so does the occupancy probability of leaf-bearing. Again, this was expected. Leaf-bearing are known to forage by clinging to stands of emergent vegetation and kind of hovering over areas of open water. And many of their prey species are fish or tadpoles, amphibians. So the more percent cover of water they have, the more foraging habitat potentially. That said, we only surveyed areas that had a maximum of 60, but most of them had much less percent cover of water. And we don't expect this relationship to be, I wouldn't expect this to go up to 100%. We keep seeing an increase in leaf-bearing. It'd likely be what's called a quadratic relationship, where it would increase, and then as it got to that other extreme, it would probably decrease again. Although we weren't able to test this in this study. Finally, we found a relationship between interspersion of vegetation and water and leaf-bearing. So there was a statistically significant difference between areas with low interspersion and high interspersion. Although you should, keep in mind these are fairly wide confidence intervals. This again is expected, as I said before. Leaf-bearing cling to areas of emergent vegetation. They kind of hover over this water and they'll pick off things in the water for foraging. And then this increase in dispersion is going to increase the amount of edge and potentially increase that foraging availability for them. Additionally, we found that water depth was positively associated with leaf-bearing. So as water depth increased, so did leaf-bearing occupancy. And again, this could have a lot of explanations, one being prey availability. So again, that fish, amphibian, but also just protection from predators. So a lot of their nest predators might be like raccoons or other mammals. They might not be as keen to go into deeper waters. The final variable we're going to talk about for habitat is density. So we found that high density vegetation or tall emergent vegetation was positively associated with leaf-bearing occupancy. And again, that is expected. It's going to create more cover for them, protection from predators, foraging habitat. So yeah, that was pretty expected. So now we can really talk about the different management characteristics. And as I said before, there hasn't been a lot of studies that have looked at these parameters. In our study, we're really trying to get at the frequency and the timing. So the first thing we're going to look at is this drawdown timing. So we decided to split this into 3 categories, but really it's more like 2. So we've got early and late season drawdowns, and then these final pools over here are going to be pools that were not drawn down that year. So they were inundated throughout the entire time of the study. And although we did see an increase in occupancy probability between early and late, that was not statistically significant. And we did see a statistical significantly more, it was more likely that leaf-bearing were going to be occupied in pools that were not drawn down. We can see that again in this graph here. So pools that were drawn down annually were significantly less likely to be occupied by leaf-bearing than pools that were drawn down less than annually. So really between 2 to or 1 to 4 times in a 5-year period. One potential explanation for this relationship is just water availability on the landscape, right? So we're drawing down these pools. They might not have water for their entire breeding period. Another explanation is pools that are drawn down annually might have less of that persistent emergent vegetation, such as cattail. So there's a couple of mechanisms, likely both are at play. We also looked at disking and other artificial disturbances, and this relationship was interesting. So originally hypothesized that less frequent disturbances would be positively associated, although we found that pools that were dissed infrequently or kind of a moderate amount of disturbance was positively associated when compared to pools that were not dissed or pools that were dissed annually. One explanation is that pools being dissed annually is just removing too much of that persistent emergent vegetation. Although pools that are not being dissed enough, they might be kind of being taken over by this robust perennial vegetation, and that interspersion component is going down. We saw the same relationship with mowing. So pools that were not mowed or pools that were mowed annually were less likely to be occupied by least bittern than pools that were mowed infrequently. Another variable for disturbance that we looked at was fire. So we have pools that were not burned and pools that were burned infrequently. There were no pools that were burned more than that, right? So this was not done commonly on landscape at all. We actually only had 5 properties that were, or 5 pools that were burned out of all of our pools. It really wasn't enough to do analysis. We'll likely need a larger sample size to kind of figure out these relationships. Herbicide was another interesting variable. So we did not detect a relationship between herbicide frequency and least bittern occupancy. A couple explanations to this. One, herbicide can be used in a wide variety of ways between pools, between properties, between managers. They could target an individual species. They could use it as setback succession. All things we didn't really account for in the study. It was just a broad category of herbicide use. Additionally, herbicide might kill emergent vegetation, but it won't necessarily remove that biomass. So that could still act as cover. That could be another reason we didn't see an effect here. So in conclusion, we surveyed 84 survey points throughout the state of Missouri at 46 wetland pools and 14 properties. We detected king rail at 4 of these properties, or 3 of these properties and 4 of these wetland pools. And although we weren't able to do a robust statistical analysis, we were able to look at least bittern. And we found that least bittern were positively associated with robust emergent vegetation and interspersed water. And we also found that management practices that are frequently conducted at some of our publicly managed wetlands might have negative associations with least bittern and potentially other secretive marsh birds. So pools that are being drawn down annually and dissed frequently may have a negative relationship with these birds. So now we kind of have to ask the question, how good of a surrogate species are least bittern when we're trying to make management decisions for king rail? So I guess first, kind of important to think about when do you want to use a surrogate species, right? So you're going to use a surrogate species when your species of interest is hard to detect and at relatively low densities, making it really difficult to do any kind of analysis, both of which are the case with king rail. Additionally, you want your 2 species, so your surrogate species and your target species, to have relatively similar habitat. And because these are the only 2 species that regularly breed throughout the state of Missouri, of secretive marsh birds anyway, it was kind of an obvious choice. That said, there are some key differences between the habitat requirements of these species. So least bittern tend to prefer areas of deeper water than king rail. King rail are known to occupy areas of shallower water. And king rail also have a higher tolerance for more percent cover of tall emergent vegetation, where least bittern really want more of a 50-50% ratio of vegetation and water on the landscape. All that being said, we're talking about management and the availability of secretive marsh bird habitat. Both of these species are going to be using persistent emergent vegetation interspersed with water. And we're talking about management and management decisions. I do think least bittern serves as a useful surrogate species for king rail with some caveats. That being said, we didn't want to stop there. We wanted to keep trying to detect the species. And one way we decided to do this was to use autonomous recording units. So in the spring and summer of 2024, we shifted our methodology to using these autonomous recording units, sometimes referred to as ARUs. And what these are, you can basically think it's just a microphone that we zip tie to a T-post and stick out on the wetland. And we can use these to record audio data for extended periods of time. So we had ours running from 2 hours before sunset to 2 hours after sunrise. and they would just record any audio data during that time. We can then run this audio data through an AI-powered software. In our case, we use BirdNet to pick out any detections of target species. You can see here that this is BirdNet. So up here is a spectrogram, and then under that is going to be the detections of King Rail. And we can zoom in, and you can see the King Rail detections right there. Although, spoiler, those are not King Rail detections. Those are most likely red-winged blackbirds. We found that, BirdNet AI it is good at detecting some species, but other species, it results in a high amount of false positives. So false positives are when you detect a species, even when it's not present, right? So you're detecting a red-winged blackbird, but it's saying it's a King Rail, but it's really some other species, which isn't great, but it's better than false negatives. So false negative would be there's a species calling, but it didn't pick that up. So we were able to go through and manually review all of these false positives to get a more accurate representation of how many King Rail were detected with these audio data, which, is a lot of work, but I think it was worth it. And what we find. So in 2023, we detected King Rail at three properties. Los Bluffs National Wildlife Refuge, Grand Pass, and BK Leach. And then in 2024, we also detected King Rail at 3 properties, although we detected them at BK Leach, Ted Shanks, and Los Bluffs. So we switched from Grand Pass to Ted Shanks for the same number of properties, and also the same number of points, so 4 survey points in total. Again, not enough for robust statistical analysis, but it was good to try different methodologies. It provided further evidence that these are really at low densities and a scattered distribution throughout the state of Missouri. So in total, 4 properties, Grand Pass, Ted Shanks, BK Leach, and Nodoy Valley Conservation Area. So pretty good range throughout the state, although very low densities. We can compare this to some of our past survey efforts. So Bob Brown Conservation Area, Fountain Grove Conservation Area, Swan Lake National Wildlife Refuge, and Clarence Canyon National Wildlife Refuge all have past detections of King Rail from previous studies, although we were not able to detect them despite pretty significant sampling effort in our surveys. We did, however, detect King Rail at BK Leach and Los Bluffs, both of which had detections of King Rail in the past, just in this might be important hotspots to conserve for King Rail in the state, as well as Ted Shanks Conservation Area. Finally, Grand Pass Conservation Area did not have detections of King Rail, despite in 2013 and 2014 a pretty thorough sampling effort throughout the site. So there is some variation within years of King Rail distribution. So I think an important thing to ask when we're talking about these species is, are we detecting them when they're present, right? This detection probability component. So a lot of our species were only detected during one sampling period. So again, I sampled 9 times. And some of these detections, especially in the ARUs, we only heard these one time. And those ARUs were out there for an entire month of just recording every night. So what's kind of going on here? Were these birds just only there for one night and they were going off somewhere else? Or are they just not calling? So either could be true, but one explanation is that King Rail will often elicit responses of other King Rail when they call. So to kind of start with one King Rail sounding off in what's called their grunt display. So one King Rail will grunt, and this will elicit a response from other nearby King Rail, and this will further elicit a response from other King Rail, kind of resulting in this chorus of King Rail calls. If you've ever been out in a wetland and you slammed your door, or sometimes people clap, you'll hear a bunch of sora go off. It's kind of the same idea. But that said, if they're at low density, so there's not lots of King Rail in the wetland pool, this behavior might not really happen, right? So if we don't have a high enough density, we might not get that same response and detection probability can plummet. And this has been shown in past research. So researchers have found that grunt calling in particular is less common in areas of low density. And we're pretty sure king rail are in very low densities in the state of Missouri, likely contributing to why we're not able to detect them very easily. Another interesting component of the study is we looked at the timing during the RARU surveys. So again, these were recording for the entire night from sunset to sunrise for an entire month, and we can look at the timing of these king rail surveys. So we have three call types. So the grunt, which is kind of your characteristic king rail call, what they call the keck, or sometimes called the male song, which is just a repeating keck note that'll kind of go out throughout the night. And then a keck burr call, which could have multiple explanations to why they do that. But it's usually thought of as a less common call type. Other studies don't report it as much. And other studies report the grunt call is the most common way of detecting king rail. However, in our study, we only detected 2 birds with a grunt call. We detected the most with this keck burr call. This is kind of providing further evidence that this lower density might be a reason we're not getting this grunt display, and we're hearing them through these other means. Additionally, the grunts were, as expected, kind of around sunrise and sunset when we're expecting to detect these species and when other surveys, like those call broadcast surveys, are being conducted. However, in our study at least, both the keck and the keck burr were detected in the middle of the night, so around 12 a.m. to 4 a.m., when most of the time we would not be surveying for these species. Another thing that is an important question to ask is, I specifically targeted areas that we determined have king rail habitat. So if there is king rail habitat in Missouri, why aren't they there? Again, a couple explanations. One being this loss of wetland habitat throughout the state of Missouri is limited the amount of wetlands on the landscape, as well as the wetland size of individual wetlands. And king rail are both associated with wetland size and the amount of wetlands on the landscape, which could be, a big predictor of why, even when there's, potential king rail habitat, they're not using it. There might just not be enough of it for them to want to stop here. Additionally, we could just not really be good at determining what king rail habitat looks like, right? So we talked to the managers and we scouted these out, but maybe, maybe I was just not very good at determining what is king rail habitat, and that's why we're not seeing it. There could be unknown variables that are affecting whether king rail want to use these sites that are not accounted for in this study or previous studies. So in conclusion, waterfowl management practices that are common throughout the state of Missouri typically promote annual drawdowns and frequent disturbances, although these practices might not be conducive to all wetland species, particularly secretive marsh birds. We found that least bittern were negatively associated with frequent disturbances and annual drawdowns. We also found that king rail were once much more abundant throughout the state, and their current distribution is very scarce and scattered throughout the state of Missouri and likely the rest of the Midwest. So what's this mean for management? Again, we're trying to find the sweet spot of waterfowl habitat, secretive marsh bird habitat, and the vegetation conditions that are being produced by our current management practices. So although waterfowl management practices have been extremely successful at restoring waterfowl populations, they might not be meeting the needs of all species. If secretive marsh bird conservation is going to be a priority for state and federal agencies, they might consider having more heterogeneity of habitat in a wetland complex. So maybe having some pools that are not drawn down every year, staggering the timing of that drawdown to allow for water on the landscape for longer, and just allowing for more heterogeneity of habitat types to meet a wider variety of species. Thank you, and I can take any questions.
Thank you, Ryan. Even though that was like pretty sobering about our king rail populations, it's not it's not excellent news. I was hoping to hear that you found lots and lots and lots throughout the state.
Right.
Um, I have a question. Do you think from what you have observed during your studies and what you might have heard from wetland managers, like do you think that there is change towards more of a broad suite of species management? I know there's a ton of factors and you're welcome to talk about any or all of them.
That's a good question. So it really depends on the manager. So some managers might be um, more keen to do some of these other management practices than others. And it's also really going to depend on the wetland property. So the amount of options we have is going to be limited by the properties and how they are situated on the landscape, right? So a lot of at least the wetlands that MDC manages, um, are fairly old and they could be just impoundments that people threw up levees around and then flooded with water. They might not have been historically wetlands and they might be very hard to hold water on for long periods of time. So those might not be areas where this is really even something that you would want to do and probably wouldn't work if you did. But there are other areas where this might be a good solution, and trying to, pick those areas and pick your battles, I think is really an important part. You don't want to fit a square peg in a round hole. You want to try to find areas where this works. And then as far as wetland management and conservation has gone, if you look at like WREs, a lot of improvements have been made, since we first started restoring wetlands and how we're restoring these. You're seeing more natural levees. You're following the landscape. You're really restoring areas that were historically wetlands. So those could potentially also offer more habitat for secretive marsh birds. But that said, yeah, it's really just trying to find managers who are interested, and then areas where that would work.
Looks like we have a question in there in the chat, just wanting to know again what that sweet spot for recommended water level depth would be.
That's a tough question. So we're talking about King Rail, and this isn't really from my study because we weren't able to do any thorough analysis. And it's also important to remember, on a study like mine, you're measuring water depths at your survey point. So we walk 25 meters out of the wetland, but that's not necessarily where the King Rail is using. So it's more looking for trends. That said, there was a paper in the Great Lakes region that was looking at King Rail populations, and they used radio transmitters. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but I want to say it was between maybe like 2 to 8 inches, so relatively shallow water depths.
I always kind of heard 12 centimeters for some reason, right in there.
Yeah, there's a lot of numbers thrown out. It's not always clear where they come from, but I think between 0 to 12 is probably a good estimate.
It might vary by what the habitat use is like in breeding season versus non-breeding season. Might vary in coastal areas versus interior areas.
Right.
There's all that suite of subspecies that we have across the continent.
There's also evidence that even between like the nesting period and the brooding period, they are changing their habitat preferences towards different water depths and different vegetative cover types. So yeah, they're hard species to manage for. They like a lot of different things, which is maybe one reason we've seen such a decline and not in other cedar marsh bird species.
I can see that difference. Their babies are little tiny black fuzzballs with, I mean, they're short, basically. Like they're not
Right.
gonna be able to hang out in 6 inch depth, right?
Yeah,
I don't know,
potentially.
unless they're, I suppose if they're swimming. I was gonna ask about, you mentioned literature review, of course, and you just mentioned a couple papers. Are populations higher and or more stable in other areas of the country? And is there like historical evidence showing that King Rail, like that Missouri was a core of their range, or were we always on the periphery, or like, I mean, or do we even know that?
Yeah, so they're definitely more stable on that resident population along the coast. They're still declining, but they're doing much better. This inland breeding population, some estimate as low as 145 breeding pairs in the entire Midwest. So that's definitely less than we're thinking. I don't think there's like great populations in other states. I think Wisconsin's got a fairly stable population. I think Illinois got some populations. There's actually a population in Kansas that seems to be, they have detections at least pretty often. As far as, Missouri's significance, I mean, I would argue, well, we don't really know, right? There's not a long-term monitoring. But I think anecdotal records report they were much more common in the state. And then past studies, from the 80s, like I was showing earlier, in that at Ted Shanks Conservation Area, which we also surveyed, I think in 6 years they detected 60 or so nests, which is crazy. That's, it's a ton. So, I can't say for sure how common they were, but I think they were definitely more common than they are now. And even in the last 20 years, right, we've seen a shrinking of their distribution. So, yeah.
Just a comment on that. I know we have a question. Hi, Steve Wilson. In that time frame, like even in the last 20 years or so, you know, public lands management has gotten more better and has gotten better and more well informed. We've put in Missouri, NRCS has put a lot of wetland reserve easements on the ground, like you said, on private lands. So it seems like habitat might have increased a bit or improved unless there was a equal amount of wetland loss during that time frame. I guess it's just that's a bit you're talking about a really big decline.
So, yeah, I think the 20-year thing is interesting. I think management is probably a big part of that, right? So, you're talking about the NRCS wetland reserve easements, which we didn't survey. We in this study, there have been other studies like you guys surveyed for them and found some, but still not huge populations, right?
They're like
So,
45 or so, and about 6 years of surveys.
right. Um, so what's that kind of mean for us? I think we're looking at, you say wetlands have or management has gotten better, but I think it's important to think about what your metric for better is. So if your metric is waterfowl, we do a great job, right? We produce a lot of food. Duck use days are huge, but that might not be the objective for or that objective might not meet the needs of every species, right? So I think um, it's hard to say if wetland management has gotten more or less intense over the years. I think probably more intense, but I don't know. We have a great way of monitoring those trends over time. But that could be one explanation, at least on public lands, we've seen this decline. But again, it could also be a lag effect from just that, 80%, 87% loss of wetlands in the United States, or probably a little bit of both. Do you want me to answer some of these online questions?
Sure. Yeah,
So
we
hybridization in rails, that does happen, not here. So here it's really only king rail that are breeding. They hybridize the clapper rails in the coast. I don't know how often, but I know it can happen. And then it sounds like Nottoway and Los Bluffs, hotspots. Yeah, so would these places be willing to dedicate areas for king rail? I think this is a good question. I would say starting at Los Bluffs, they do already have a lot of more marsh habitat, so more semi-permanent pools. It's just a large complex. They're less beholden to maybe waterfowl hunters, so they're able to have more, I would say, diversity. BK Leach is another interesting property. So this actually is technically NRCS WRE property, but it was bought up by MDC and is now one of our intensively managed wetlands that is included in the waterfowl draw. So it's kind of an interesting property where you can't really do food plots or ag crop at huge scales, but it still has a high public demand for good waterfowl habitat. But it does have more marsh vegetation, and they actually do have a area that's pretty much dedicated to king rail and other secretive marsh birds. It's called Bittern Basin's one of the units. where one of their pools is semi-permanent. And then, yeah, Ted Shanks is another interesting one where they do mostly do annual drawdowns. However, I'm currently working on a new project that is looking at how we can do slight changes to management practices. Initially, we're going to look at water, so trying to meet both waterfowl and cedar marsh bird needs. So we're going to start looking at drawdown timing, so we can just extend that hydro period into at least till June, at least portions of the pool, and see if that makes a difference. So we're going to start that at Ted Shanks and BK Leach, at least a few pools. And this will be kind of a pilot study to see, we first want to make sure it's not going to compromise waterfowl management objectives, which is, the primary objective of a lot of these properties.
Thank you, Ryan. I sort of wish that I had heard this talk when we first started studying marsh birds too, because I feel like you've been very enlightening in terms of like balancing all of those different objectives and different like stakeholder interests.
It's
So
hard, and they're constantly changing, right? The different stakeholders and how vocal different stakeholders are. So it's always, it's not an easy job being a wetland manager. You're trying to manage for tons of different people and different things, and it can be very challenging. But that said, we can try to identify areas of overlap and objectives that work well together, and maybe areas where, like I said, you don't want to fit a square peg in a round hole. So areas that it just makes more sense to have more emergent marsh habitat, but maybe areas where you have sandy soils that really don't hold a lot of water, that might be a better place for more moist soil or even food plots to produce good waterfowl habitat. And again, trying to get a diversity in the landscape is something I think is important as well.
I guess I did have a question if there's no other ones floating around there. And I was wondering about, I guess it's kind of twofold, but linked. One is if there's patch size effects, if you know of any patch size effects on, for those in the audience, if you have a larger area, sometimes it's more conducive to certain species where other species can uh, successfully reproduce in a smaller area of quality habitat. So I was wondering if that was one thing. And then if you, relatedly, if you had a sense for this really looks like king rail habitat, this place really looks good for them. Is it like a perennial vegetation component? Is there other aspects to it, like the gestalt of the land kind of thing? Yeah.
So, onto the last question first. I think I have that sense, but then I didn't take very many king rails, so maybe I don't. I don't know. But yeah, I would typically think perennial vegetation, cattail, bulrush, and then that interspersion of vegetation and water. And then shallow water depths, I think, are another big component. They also like areas that are maybe close to areas of open water, but then also, maybe having some more mud flats for brood rain. So they like a lot of things, probably is one of the reasons they're challenging. And I've already forgotten your first question. It was
Just patch size, if there's anybody had any data on that.
right. So yeah, it's that same paper I was referencing for water depth. They did estimate home range size. So this is something I was thinking about when we were thinking about this upcoming project. Because we're going to try to tweak management. So we're thinking about, okay, we're going to tweak management. How much emergent marsh do we really need, or how much water? And in that study, they estimated a home range with a mean of about 25 acres, but it had a huge range. So it's hard to say exactly what is needed, but we're going to go with trying to get around 25 acres of at least area of the pool that's wet until the end of June.
Hey, that's a lot more doable than prairie chicken range patch requirements.
Right, right.
Dean's got a question in the chat, Ryan.
Oh, here we go. Oh, reintroduction is an interesting idea. So these are a migratory bird, so it would be a difficult thing to do. I think there's been some work looking at playing playback in a wetland during migration. So hopefully you can they fly over and they hear other king rail calling, they think that might be a more suitable habitat. I think you have to be careful when you're doing that because, again, like I was saying earlier, I think I know what good king rail habitat is, but maybe I don't, right? I don't want to check birds that might go somewhere more suitable to a place that is less suitable. But it is an option, but we're not exploring that right now. Um, yeah, I don't know of any reductions of rail, but maybe it's happened somewhere.
Ryan, what you said just now about it being possibly quite risky to attract a species into an area if we're not sure. Um, do you think that there are, or have there been studies on um, the effects of, I guess I'm thinking largely like insecticides and how those move in the food chain and how they, decrease our food chains sort of from the bottom up, right? And I believe that like neonics are not used on MDC areas. Um, or at least there was discussion of some of them or in the future all of them or whatever. But is there any evidence that that might be a factor, or do you think it might be a factor?
Right. So we don't use neonicotinoids on NBC areas, but that said, the surrounding landowners are probably using neonicotinoids, so it's probably there's a good chance it's getting in there. Um, how that affects king rail, I don't know if there's been a ton of research, but the biggest prey item for king rail is going to be crayfish, so that could pretty drastically impact those species. And there are a couple NDC projects looking at crayfish and wetland management, and there's also a larger invert study, I think at Mizzou right now, looking at neonicotinoids and invertebrates. So there's more to come. There's probably also more research if I searched for it, but I don't know off the top of my head exactly those relationships.
Okay, all. If there's any more questions, now's the time.
Have there been any surveys on private lands? The Missouri River Bird Observatory, it's just kind of, I don't know. I don't know much about them, but I think they've done some.
Yes, we did quite a few private
Planted
lands.
question, planted question.
Yeah, but private lands really do show like amazing potential and all the things, that Ryan just outlined a whole bunch of other factors where private landowners maybe have better potential opportunity to do more better management as well. I mean, just like those other states he was mentioning, we have like 95% private land. So I think reliance and working with private landowners is probably key, I'd imagine. From
I think,
people that had the opportunity to really enjoy surveying those private wetlands too. They're just a joy.
yeah, I think Missouri is a state that you just have to work with private landowners to meet any conservation objectives, right? I mean, it's just, there's such a big portion of the landscape. As far as King Rail, I will say, I think they have potential, and I think likely they're less intensively managed. Well, that said, most people who are going to enroll in the WE program are probably doing it for waterfowl hunting. So that could also, you know, these issues could still persist on private lands, and it's really going to depend on who owns it and how they manage it. Um,
From our experience, I would suggest that I completely agree with probably most private landowners' objectives, but they don't have the infrastructure to do things like totally draw down, right? In some cases, I mean, some do, but not all do. It's kind of pulling boards out of water control structures to do some draining, to do the same sort of work that you just described in your presentation with annual vegetation and things like that. But rarely can they pump back in to flood. And so point being, like they seem to be by and large more subject to like the natural hydrology of where more so, because the infrastructure isn't the same.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I don't know exactly. I know there are some WREs that might have pumping capabilities, but I don't have an idea of what percent. I think it'd be a small percent. I guess the other component is just like we were saying, that size component. So if King Rail do need a wetland complex or a certain size, maybe WREs aren't going to be suitable, and we need areas like our publicly managed wetlands to kind of fill that niche. But yeah, it's hard to say until we do more monitoring.
I could talk about this stuff all night. It's really great. Thank you so much for presenting. It's I'm really glad you've done this work and are keeping at it and doing speaking up for our marsh birds out there.
All right, we're a little over time, so I hope you can see, Ryan, the comments there in the chat that are coming in. So cool. Yes, thank you for what you are doing.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me, and thanks everybody for listening. Yeah, I always want to talk about marsh birds, so it's been a pleasure.
Cool. All right, good night, everybody. Thanks for joining.